15 years after the boy vanished into the forest, a hiker stumbled upon his camera. The photos inside were taken after he disappeared. And they were wrong. The hiker, a young woman named Sarah, hadn't been looking for anything more than a quiet day away from the city noise, a trail she'd found on an old map. The camera was nestled at the base of a thick, old pine, half buried under a generation of fallen needles and leaf litter, as if the earth itself had tried to swallow it whole. It was caked in mud, the plastic casing cracked and faded, a relic from another time. She almost dismissed it as forgotten trash, another piece of human carelessness marring the wilderness. But something made her pick it up. Maybe it was the way the weak afternoon sun caught a glint of the lens, like a single, unblinking eye staring up from the dirt. Or perhaps it was just a gut feeling, a prickle of unease that the forest sometimes whispered to those who listened. She turned it over in her hands. It was an older model, clunky by today's standards, a brand she vaguely remembered from her childhood. The battery compartment was corroded, but the small door for the memory card, surprisingly, was still clicked shut, protected by a dried layer of mud that had acted like a seal. What were the chances? She thought. After all this time, curiosity, stronger than her unease, made her slip it into her backpack. Later that evening, back in her small apartment, she managed to pry open the memory card slot. The card itself was tiny, an early type, but it looked intact. Her laptop didn't have a slot for it, so the next day, she took it to a camera shop, an old place run by a man who'd seen technology come and go. He had the right adapter. He seemed unsurprised. People found things, he said. The past had a way of resurfacing. When the first image finally loaded onto his monitor, Sarah leaned in. It was a blurry shot of trees, green and dense, the kind you'd expect. Then another, a slightly clearer view of a narrow, overgrown path. The third showed a pair of worn hiking boots, presumably the photographer's, resting on a mossy rock. Standard stuff. The shop owner grunted, ready to dismiss it. But Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was something about the date stamp in the corner of the files, if it was accurate. 1998, a long time ago. She remembered a local story, a chilling one, from when she was just a kid, a boy, a hiking trip, vanished. The shop owner clicked to the next photo, and the air in the small, cluttered shop seemed to grow cold. This one was different. It was dark, poorly lit, as if taken inside a tent or a small, enclosed space, but there were no clear signs of a tent. Or maybe it was taken at night, with a weak flash. In the center, slightly out of focus, was a face. A young face. Pale, eyes wide, and reflecting the flash. The expression was hard to read. Fear? Surprise? It was a selfie, but not a happy one. The date stamp was the same as the others. But then came the next. The timestamp was hours later. The image was a chaotic blur of leaves and branches, as if the camera had been dropped or swung wildly. Then another, a close-up of something dark and textured, unidentifiable. Then another, showing a patch of sky through a tiny opening in what looked like dense undergrowth or maybe something else. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. These weren't holiday snaps. The shop owner, silent now, kept clicking. Each photo seemed stranger than the last. Some were almost completely black. Others showed fleeting, distorted shapes. One showed a hand, small and dirty, reaching out. Whose hand? The boy's? The last few images were the worst. They were almost abstract in their terror, streaks of light and shadow, a sense of frantic movement. But one, the very last one, was clearer, starkly so. It showed a small, crude drawing scratched into bare earth. A stick figure, lying down, and next to it, another, larger figure, standing over it. Sarah's breath hitched. She knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in her veins, what this camera meant. She knew whose camera it had been. The shop owner finally looked up, his face grim. "You need to take this to the police," he said, his voice quiet. "This isn't just lost property, this is something else." He didn't need to explain. The name of the boy, unspoken for years in any official capacity, hung heavy in the air between them. Mark Weatherton, 14 years old, vanished without a trace from the Blackwood Trail 15 years ago. And these pictures, these strange, disturbing pictures, were taken after everyone thought he was gone. What had happened to him out there, alone in the woods? And what terrible story did these silent images hold? The plastic casing of the camera suddenly felt cold, almost malevolent, in her memory. A forgotten object, holding a forgotten boy's last moments. Or had it? The question pulsed in the quiet room. What did these images truly mean? The call to the local sheriff's department was brief. The initial reaction one of mild bureaucratic interest. Lost property. Old case. It wasn't until Sarah mentioned the photos, the nature of the photos, that the tone on the other end of the line shifted. Detective Miles Corbin was assigned the file, more out of a sense of due diligence than any real expectation. He was a man who had seen too much, a man whose hope had been worn thin by years of unsolved cases and human misery. The Mark Weatherton file was legendary in the department, a ghost story told to new recruits, a symbol of the one that got away, swallowed by the wilderness, or by something else. Corbin remembered it vaguely. He'd been a rookie in a different precinct back then, but the headlines had been stark. Boy Scout vanishes. Massive search yields nothing. The woods were deep, unforgiving. It happened. But a camera, 15 years later, with photos taken after he was reported missing, that was new. That was a thread, however frayed, to pull. He met Sarah at the station. She looked shaken, handing over the camera and the memory card as if eager to be rid of them. She recounted her story, her voice low. Corbin listened, his face impassive, but his mind was already racing. What if the boy hadn't just gotten lost? What if he'd been alive for hours, maybe days, after the search parties had given up their first sweep? The memory card was sent to the state crime lab. They had better equipment, better software for recovering and enhancing old digital files. Corbin knew it was a long shot. Digital data degraded. The camera had been out in the elements for a decade and a half. What could possibly have survived? He pulled the old Weatherton file, a thick, dusty accordion folder filled with yellowing papers, maps with faded highlighter marks, and grainy photos of search teams fanning out into the trees. Reports detailed the initial response. The scoutmaster, a man named Alistair Finch, had reported Mark missing late in the afternoon of October 10, 1998. Finch had told deputies that Mark, always a bit of a straggler, had fallen behind the main group during a hike on the less traveled parts of the Blackwood Trail system. They'd waited, called out. No answer. Finch, an experienced hiker, claimed he'd backtracked, searched for a while, then, with daylight fading and other boys to consider, made the tough call to hike out and get help. He'd seemed flustered, perhaps a little defensive, the original reports noted. The search had started that night, a frantic, disorganized affair in the dark. By morning, it was a full-scale operation. Hundreds of volunteers, police, dogs. They'd scoured the area for weeks. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a dropped piece of equipment. Not a shred of clothing. It was as if Mark Weatherton had simply evaporated. The official theory, after all avenues were exhausted, was that he'd gotten lost, succumbed to exposure, or perhaps fallen into one of the park's many hidden ravines or old mine shafts. His body never found. A tragic accident. But there were always whispers, doubts, the way Finch had seemed a little too quick to leave him, the fact that no trace was ever found. Now, this camera. Corbin stared at the property tag on the evidence bag. Could this old piece of plastic finally break the silence of 15 years? Or would it only add another layer of pain, another unanswerable question, to a tragedy that had long since faded from public memory, but never from the hearts of those who knew the boy? He thought of the parents. He'd have to notify them. That was the part of the job he dreaded most, reopening old wounds, offering a sliver of something that might be hope, or might just be more torment. The lab called a few days later. They'd recovered images. Quite a few, actually. The technician sounded hesitant. "You need to see these, detective," he'd said. "There's something about them, something you don't see every day." Corbin felt a cold anticipation. What had Mark seen in those last hours? What secrets had he captured before the darkness took him, or before something or someone else did? The forest had held its breath for 15 years. Now, it seemed, it was finally ready to exhale a piece of its story. But would it be a story anyone was prepared to hear? The original disappearance, back in 1998, had torn a hole in the small community of Oakhaven. Mark Weatherton was just 14, a quiet boy, more interested in books and drawing than the rough and tumble of most kids his age. He'd joined the scout troop, his mother later said, because he'd wanted to try to push himself a little. He loved the idea of the woods, the quiet majesty of them, even if he wasn't the fastest or the strongest. The hike on that October day was meant to be a challenge, but manageable. Troop 42, led by Scoutmaster Alistair Finch, was a small group, just Finch and 5 boys, including Mark. They were exploring a less-used network of trails in Blackwood State Park, aiming for a scenic overlook. Mark, as usual, had been lagging a bit. He'd stopped to look at some interesting fungus, Finch would later recount, or maybe to tie his shoe. The other boys, eager to reach the summit, had pushed on ahead with Finch occasionally calling back, "Hurry up, Mark!" The group reached a fork in the trail. Finch said he shouted for Mark, waited a few minutes. He claimed he heard a faint reply, something like, "Coming!" So, they took the steeper path, assuming Mark would catch up. He never did. It was another hour before they reached the overlook. When Mark still hadn't appeared, a flicker of annoyance turned into a knot of concern. Finch sent 2 of the faster boys back down the trail a little way, calling Mark's name. Nothing. Just the rustle of autumn leaves in the breeze and the chirping of unseen birds. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, beautiful but also a warning. Finch, according to his statement, then made the decision. He said he told the boys, "Mark probably took the wrong turn at the fork, or he's slower than we thought. He'll turn up, or he'll head back to the trailhead if he's smart. We need to get out before dark." But one of the other boys, years later in an informal interview for a cold case podcast, remembered it differently. He recalled Finch sighing, saying something like, "That kid is always holding us up. He's probably halfway back to the parking lot by now, tired of waiting for us." There was an edge to his voice, the boy had said, a dismissal that felt cold even then. They hadn't waited long. They hadn't searched much. They'd hiked out, the remaining boys quiet, uneasy. It was nearly dark when Finch finally called the park rangers, then the sheriff. The initial search was hampered by the night, by the rugged terrain. Mark's parents, Tom and Laura Weatherton, arrived at the trailhead in a state of growing panic. Laura remembered standing there, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles cutting through the darkness, the shouts of searchers echoing faintly from the woods, feeling a cold dread creep into her heart. This couldn't be happening, not to Mark. He was a good boy, a careful boy. He wouldn't just wander off. Days turned into weeks. The search grew, then shrank. Hope dwindled with each passing day, each failed sweep of the grid. The dogs found no scent. The helicopters saw nothing through the dense canopy. Volunteers found discarded candy wrappers, old beer cans, but nothing belonging to Mark. It was, as one seasoned tracker put it, like the woods had just opened up and swallowed him. Alistair Finch was questioned, of course, multiple times. He stuck to his story. He'd made a judgment call. He expressed regret, sorrow. But there was no evidence of foul play, no sign of an accident at any specific location. He'd been negligent, perhaps. His leadership was certainly criticized. Some parents pulled their boys from his troop. But legally, there was nothing to hold him on. The prevailing theory settled into the grim comfort of a wilderness accident. Mark had gotten lost. He'd been alone. He'd succumbed to the elements, or a fall. His body lay somewhere deep in the park, reclaimed by nature. Tom and Laura Weatherton never accepted it. Not fully. How could a boy just vanish? Without a trace? They'd funded private searches, consulted psychics, put up posters that faded and tore over the years until they were just sad reminders of a grief that never truly went away. The forest around Oakhaven became a place of sorrow for them, a constant, silent accuser. Every rustling leaf, every shadow under the trees seemed to whisper his name. And now, 15 years later, a camera. A camera that had been with Mark. A camera that held images from those lost hours. What would it show? Would it confirm their worst fears? Or, almost impossibly, could it offer something else? A clue? An answer? The thought was a painful spark in a darkness they had lived in for so long. Detective Corbin arranged to view the recovered photos in a small, darkened room at the crime lab. The technician, a young man named Dave, had them loaded on a large monitor. "There are about 38 images in total that we could recover, Detective," Dave said, his voice neutral but with an undercurrent Corbin couldn't quite place. "The first few, as reported, are standard, taken in daylight. Looks like just before he got separated." He clicked through them. Trees, a path, Mark's boots. Then, the selfie. Mark's face, pale, eyes wide. Corbin leaned closer. The fear was there, definitely. But also, confusion. He looked young. So young. Barely a teenager, lost in the wilderness. "The timestamp on this one is about 2 hours after Finch, and the others would have left him at that fork," Dave said, his finger hovering over the data displayed beneath the image. So he was alive. And he had his camera. That much was already a blow to the old narrative. He hadn't just wandered off and immediately fallen or gotten hopelessly lost. He was aware, functioning, for a while at least. Then came the next photo. The chaotic blur of leaves. "This is where it starts to get unusual," Dave murmured. He clicked again. A close-up of dark, damp earth, something that looked like moss, and what might have been a strip of blue fabric at the very edge of the frame. Too indistinct to be sure. Another click. A photo taken, looking almost straight up. A tiny patch of gray sky, framed by what looked like the edges of a hole, or a narrow opening between rocks. Was he in a cave? A crevice? The light was poor. "He's using the flash sporadically here," Dave noted. "Maybe trying to conserve the battery. Or maybe he didn't want to attract attention." Attract attention from what? Or whom? Corbin felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This was not going to be simple. The next image made him frown. It was angled downwards, showing what appeared to be the interior of a very small, confined space. The walls were rough, earthen, and in the foreground, out of focus but undeniably present, was a glint of metal. Part of a can? A buckle? It was impossible to tell. Then, a series of very dark photos, almost completely black. Dave adjusted the brightness on the monitor. Faint shapes emerged. "We think he was moving through somewhere very dark here," Dave said. "Or he was hiding. Hiding from what? The elements? Or something more?" One photo showed what looked like a pile of rocks, unnaturally stacked. Another, a blurry image of something pale against a dark background. Bone? A piece of trash? The ambiguity was maddening. Corbin remembered the original searchers, combing every known cave and crevice. Had they missed something? Or had Mark found a place they hadn't even known existed? The hand. The photo of the small, dirty hand reaching out. Corbin stared at it. It was Mark's hand, he was sure. But what was it reaching for? Or from? It looked desperate. The quality degrades significantly in these later shots, Dave said, his voice softer now. The camera was old even then. Low resolution, poor, low light performance. He clicked again. An image that was just streaks of light, as if Mark had been running or falling, the shutter held open. Then, the second to last photo. It was taken from a very low angle, pointing slightly upwards. It showed the underside of something. Rough-hewn wooden planks, old and weathered, with gaps between them. Light filtered through the gaps. It looked like the underside of a floor, or a dilapidated bridge, or the roof of something crude, hastily built. Where would you find something like that, deep in Blackwood Park? There were no authorized structures in that remote area. Old hunters' blinds, maybe, but this looked different. More enclosed. Corbin felt a chill. You could almost feel the dampness, the confinement, emanating from the image. This wasn't just a boy lost in the woods. This felt like something else entirely. And then, "This is the last one," Dave said. His voice barely a whisper. He clicked. The crude drawing, scratched into dirt. The small stick figure, prone. The larger one, standing over it. Simple, childlike, and utterly terrifying. Corbin stared, his mind racing. Was this Mark's depiction of himself and someone else? An attacker? A captor? Or was it just the fearful imagining of a lost, scared boy? The rawness of it, the starkness, was undeniable. This was not a map. This was a message, a testament. After a long silence, Corbin finally spoke. He wasn't alone, was he? Dave shook his head slowly. Doesn't look like it, Detective. Not at the end. The implications were staggering. If Mark was with someone, who was it? And what had happened in that dark, confined space, under those rough wooden planks? The theory of him simply succumbing to the elements felt suddenly, horribly inadequate. The photos didn't show an animal attack. They hinted at something human, something deliberate. The woods hadn't just swallowed Mark Weatherton. It felt more like they had hidden him, or hidden what was done to him. Corbin thought of Tom and Laura Weatherton. How could he possibly show them this? These fragmented glimpses into their son's final, terrifying hours. It was a truth, perhaps, but a truth that might shatter them all over again. Yet, they deserved to know. And Mark deserved for someone to understand what these pictures meant. What was the story he was trying to tell with his dying battery, his failing light? The news of the camera's discovery, and the existence of new photos, reached Tom and Laura Weatherton like a distant tremor. An echo of an earthquake they had survived long ago, but whose aftershocks still rattled their lives. Detective Corbin had called them himself. He'd been gentle, cautious, warning them that the images were disturbing and unclear. He'd offered to come to their home. They lived in the same small house on the edge of Oakhaven, the one Mark had grown up in. His room was still his room, a shrine of arrested development, posters of spaceships and dinosaurs, a shelf of well-read fantasy novels, a collection of intricately drawn maps of imaginary lands. Laura had kept it that way. Tom hadn't been able to bring himself to change it either. It was as if, by preserving the space, they were preserving a sliver of hope, however irrational, that he might one day return to it. Corbin arrived on a gray afternoon. The sky outside matched the mood inside the neat, quiet house. He sat with them at their kitchen table, the same table where Mark had once done his homework, where they'd shared countless family meals. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken grief and a new, terrible anticipation. Laura's hands trembled as she clutched a worn handkerchief. Tom sat ramrod straight, his face a mask of stoic pain, but Corbin saw the flicker of raw hope and dread in his eyes. "We don't know what these pictures mean for sure," Corbin began, his voice low and steady. "They're fragmented. They raise more questions than answers right now. But they do show that Mark was alive for some time after he was separated from his group." Laura let out a small, choked sob. Tom reached over and covered her hand with his. "He had his camera with him," Corbin continued, laying out a few carefully selected prints on the table. Not the most disturbing ones, not yet. He showed them the selfie. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My baby." Tom stared at the image of his son, his expression unreadable. It was Mark, undeniably. But the fear in his eyes was a fresh stab to the heart. He looked so alone, so vulnerable. Corbin then showed them the photo of the sky through the small opening and the one of the glint of metal in the earthen space. He described carefully some of the other images, the darkness, the sense of confinement. He avoided, for now, the drawing. "We believe he might have found some kind of shelter," Corbin said. "A cave, an old structure, we're not sure. The photos are very unclear in places." Was he hurt?" Tom asked, his voice raspy. We can't tell from these, Mr. Weatherton. He appears to be moving around in some of them. But he was clearly in a distressing situation. Laura was weeping openly now, a quiet, heartbroken sound. Tom held her, his own eyes glistening. The pain of 15 years, always simmering beneath the surface, had boiled over. It was the not knowing that had been a unique form of torture. Now, they knew a little more. And that little more was terrifying. Did he die out there? Alone? Laura managed to ask, her voice thick with tears. Corbin hesitated. This was the hardest part. The last few photos are very difficult, Mrs. Weatherton. They suggest he might not have been alone. He saw the flicker of confusion, then dawning horror in their eyes. What do you mean? Tom asked, his voice sharp. Corbin took a deep breath. He hadn't wanted to show them the drawing, not here, not now, but they needed to understand the direction the investigation was now taking. He carefully placed the print of the stick figures on the table. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight. Laura stared at it, her face ashen. Tom picked it up, his hand shaking slightly. He traced the crude lines with his finger. What is this? He whispered, though he knew. He knew what it looked like. We don't know for sure, Corbin said softly, but it's the last clear image on the camera. It suggests someone else might have been there. Laura made a sound, a low moan of utter despair. The thought of Mark, lost and scared, was agony enough. The thought of him facing some unknown human threat in his final moments was unbearable. Who? Tom demanded, his voice rising. Who was with him? Did they hurt him? We don't know, Mr. Weatherton. That's what we're trying to find out. These photos, they're a new lead. A very old lead, but new to us. The hope that had flickered briefly in their hearts was now extinguished, replaced by a fresh wave of grief, this time laced with a cold, terrifying anger. Their son hadn't just been a victim of the wilderness. He might have been a victim of something far more sinister. The old wound hadn't just been reopened. It had been deepened, poisoned. The camera, that small, forgotten object, had brought their son back to them in the most ghostly, heartbreaking way. It offered glimpses, whispers, but no peace. Only a new, sharper set of questions, and a renewed, desperate need for answers that had been denied them for so long. As Corbin left their home, he knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter in their pain. The photos were a key, but to what door? And what horrors lay beyond it? The weight of Mark's lost voice, speaking through these silent, desperate images, settled heavily on his shoulders. The discovery of Mark Weatherton's camera, and the unsettling images it contained, sent ripples through the quiet corridors of the sheriff's department. Detective Miles Corbin found himself at the center of a revived investigation, one that now carried the heavy weight of 15 years of silence. The first step was a meticulous analysis of the photographs, trying to wring every possible clue from the grainy, low-resolution images. Corbin, along with Dave from the crime lab and a handful of other investigators, spent days staring at the enlarged prints, projected images, and digitally enhanced files. The selfie of Mark was scrutinized. His expression, the reflection in his eyes, could it reveal anything about his surroundings? Experts tried to identify the type of foliage in the background of the clearer outdoor shots, hoping to narrow down a more specific search area within the vastness of Blackwood Park. The photo of the blue fabric scrap, was it part of Mark's clothing or someone else's? His parents couldn't recall him owning anything that particular shade of blue. The glint of metal in the earthen confinement, they enhanced it, sharpened it. It looked like the rusted edge of a food can, perhaps, or a piece of discarded camping gear. Nothing definitive. The picture of the underside of the wooden planks became a focal point. What kind of structure would have such a floor or roof deep in the woods? Park officials confirmed there were no authorized buildings, no old cabins or ranger outposts in that specific sector where Mark was last seen. There were legends of old, abandoned mine shafts, some partially boarded up, but the photos didn't quite fit that description. This felt more like a den, a crude shelter, or a prison. The mid-spike in the investigation came not from a single dramatic revelation, but from a slow, dawning horror as they pieced together the sequence of photos. Mark was alive. He was moving. He was in a confined, dark space. And then, the drawing. The stick figures. It was the drawing that shifted everything. It moved the needle firmly from tragic accident to possible foul play. The larger figure, dominant, looming. It was hard to see it as anything but a threat. This led them to a critical question. Was Mark alone when he took these photos, documenting his fear and his surroundings? Or was someone else there, perhaps even forcing him? Some of the images were so chaotic, so blurry. Was it the disorientation of a lost boy, or the result of a struggle, the camera capturing frantic moments? One particular photo, previously overlooked due to its poor quality, was painstakingly enhanced. It was one of the very dark ones, taken inside what they now believed was the crude shelter. After hours of digital manipulation, a faint shape emerged in the deep background, something that wasn't just shadow or rock. It was a silhouette, vaguely human-shaped, but distorted, partially obscured. It was impossible to identify, impossible to be sure it wasn't just a trick of light and shadow, a product of pareidolia. But the suggestion was chilling. Was someone else in the shelter with Mark, watching him? Or had he photographed his captor unawares? The abduction theory, once a whisper in the background, now gained terrifying traction. He wasn't just lost in hiding. He might have been taken, held. The implications were horrifying. If he was abducted, by whom? A drifter, a local, someone who knew the woods, someone capable of snatching a boy without leaving a trace? Corbin felt a cold dread. If Mark had been abducted, his chances of survival would have been slim. And the fact that his body was never found, it pointed to a killer who was careful, methodical, or incredibly lucky. The team began to look at old missing persons files from around that time. Unsolved violent crimes in the region. Was there a pattern? A predator who might have been operating in the area? The search was frustrating, like looking for a single dark grain of sand on a vast, dark beach. The photos were too ambiguous. They hinted, they suggested, but they didn't provide concrete evidence. They didn't show another face clearly. They didn't pinpoint a location with certainty. They were ghosts of moments, taunting the investigators with their secrets. The weight of the case pressed down on Corbin. He found himself looking at Mark's young, scared face in the selfie, again and again. What did you see, kid? What were you trying to tell us? The forest had kept its secrets for 15 years. Now, it seemed, it was offering a puzzle, a series of terrifying breadcrumbs leading into an even deeper darkness. The question was no longer just where Mark had gone, but who he had been with. And that question opened up a whole new realm of fear and uncertainty. The team felt it, the shift from a cold case review to something active, something that felt like hunting a ghost, or worse, a monster who had walked free for far too long. The silence of the woods suddenly felt less like peace and more like a conspiracy. The new direction of the investigation inevitably led back to Alistair Finch, the scoutmaster who had been leading Mark's group that fateful day in 1998. If Mark had been abducted, the window of opportunity for that abduction was narrow. It had to have happened after Finch and the other boys left him, and before whatever end Mark had met. Corbin reviewed Finch's original statements. Finch had claimed he backtracked, called for Mark, got a faint response, then proceeded, assuming Mark would catch up. He'd seemed adamant about that faint response. But what if it wasn't Mark he heard? Or what if he heard nothing at all, and his decision to leave a 14-year-old boy behind in remote wilderness was even more reckless than it already seemed? Finch still lived in Oakhaven. He was older now, grayer, his face etched with the lines of a life that had clearly been impacted by the events of that day. The shadow of Mark Weatherton's disappearance had never fully left him. Despite the lack of criminal charges, he'd lost his scoutmaster position, faced community ostracism for a time. He now ran a small, struggling hardware store. Corbin decided to pay him a visit, unannounced. He found Finch stocking shelves, his movements slow, deliberate. When Corbin introduced himself, mentioned the Weatherton case, Finch's face went pale. He knew about the camera. News, even sensitive news, traveled fast in a town like Oakhaven, especially when it concerned its most enduring mystery. "I heard they found something," Finch said, his voice barely above a whisper. He avoided Corbin's gaze. "His camera." "That's right," Corbin said, watching him closely. "We're re-examining everything, Mr. Finch. The photos, they change things." Finch flinched, almost imperceptibly. He finally looked at Corbin, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and something else. "Fear? Guilt? I told them everything back then," he said, his voice defensive. "Everything I knew. It was a terrible accident. I've lived with that every day for 15 years. The photos suggest it might not have been an accident, Mr. Finch," Corbin said, his tone even. "They suggest Mark might have encountered someone else out there." Finch's breath hitched. He leaned against a shelf for support. "Someone else? Who? What are you saying?" "That's what we're trying to find out." Corbin paused, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Mr. Finch, when you went back to look for Mark at the fork in the trail, are you absolutely certain you heard him respond?" Finch's eyes darted away. He licked his lips. It was faint. The wind was picking up, but I was sure at the time." His voice trailed off. The certainty he'd projected in 1998 seemed to have eroded over the years. "Did you see anyone else out there that day, Mr. Finch?" Corbin pressed. "Anyone at all? Hikers? Campers? Anyone who seemed out of place?" Finch shook his head slowly. "No, we were the only ones on that trail, as far as I knew. It wasn't a popular route." Corbin showed him a few of the photos, carefully chosen, nothing too graphic, but enough to convey the situation. The selfie, the confined space. Finch stared at them, his hand trembling slightly as he held a print. His face, already pale, seemed to lose even more color. "My God," he whispered. "The poor boy. What happened to him? Was his shock genuine? Or was it the reaction of a man confronted with evidence he hoped would never surface?" Corbin couldn't tell. Finch was an old man now, seemingly broken by the past. But people were capable of hiding terrible things. The classic legal system, as some in the town had grumbled back then, had cleared Finch. Negligence wasn't murder. Leaving a boy behind, however irresponsible, wasn't, in itself, proof of complicity in something worse. But the new photos, while not directly implicating Finch in any post-disappearance events, certainly intensified the scrutiny on his initial actions. Had his delay in reporting Mark missing given someone else an opportunity? Had his decision to leave Mark been born of mere carelessness, or something more calculated? Public opinion in Oakhaven, which had largely settled into a kind of resigned acceptance of Finch's limited culpability, began to stir again. Whispers followed him. Old suspicions resurfaced. The camera had brought Mark's ghost back, and that ghost now seemed to hover directly over Alistair Finch. Yet, the photos provided no direct link to Finch after Mark was alone. They were a record of Mark's terrifying ordeal, but not necessarily of who orchestrated it. Finch, for his part, maintained his ignorance, his regret. He offered to help in any way he could, but his memory of that day was, he claimed, clouded by time and trauma. Corbin left Finch's store with a sense of deep frustration. The photos were a powerful, emotional catalyst, but they weren't a smoking gun pointing at any one individual. Finch's reaction could be that of a man with a guilty conscience, or simply a man haunted by a tragic mistake that had defined his life. The shadow of the scoutmaster loomed large over the case, but it remained just that, a shadow, indistinct, impossible to grasp. The law needed more than shadows. It needed proof. And proof, after 15 years, was proving as elusive as Mark Weatherton himself had been. The camera had opened a door, but it seemed to lead into a hall of mirrors, each reflection more disturbing and less clear than the last. Armed with the unsettling clues from Mark Weatherton's camera, Detective Corbin organized a new search of the Blackwood Trail area. 15 years was a long time. The forest was a living, changing entity. Trails eroded, trees fell, undergrowth reclaimed what was once clear. But the photos, however grainy, offered potential reference points. The type of rock formation seen in one shot, the specific density of trees in another, the possible orientation of the crude shelter relative to a distinctive ridgeline hinted at in the background of an upward-angled photo. Corbin consulted with forestry experts, geologists, and experienced trackers. They pored over old maps and the new images, trying to triangulate a plausible search zone. It was a daunting task. The area where Mark went missing was rugged, remote, miles of dense woods, steep ravines, and hidden hollows. The search teams were smaller this time, more focused. They consisted of law enforcement, a few seasoned search and rescue volunteers who remembered the original effort, and a forensic team hoping to find any physical evidence that might have been missed or might have surfaced over the years. They started near the fork in the trail where Mark was last seen with his group, fanning out in meticulous grid patterns. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves underfoot rustled with each step, a constant whispering reminder of the passage of time. Days turned into a week. The initial optimism began to fade, replaced by a grim determination. The forest seemed to actively resist their efforts. Paths shown on old maps were now impassable, choked with thorny bushes. Areas that looked promising in aerial photos turned out to be inaccessible cliffs or swampy bogs. They found old campsites, beer cans, modern trash left by inconsiderate hikers. Nothing connected to Mark. Nothing that matched the strange, confined spaces hinted at in his photographs. Corbin walked the lines with his team, his eyes scanning every rock outcropping, every fallen log, every dark shadow under the trees. He carried prints of Mark's photos, constantly comparing the images to the landscape around him. Was that the same type of moss Mark had photographed up close? Was that ridge in the distance the one visible through the opening in the shelter? The forest offered up tantalizing maybes, but no certainties. One afternoon, a young deputy called out. He'd found something. Tucked into a narrow crevice between two large boulders, almost invisible beneath a covering of damp leaves, was a small, rusted metal object. Corbin's heart leaped. It was a belt buckle. Old, corroded, but distinctly a belt buckle. He carefully bagged it. Later at the station, they would compare it to descriptions of Mark's clothing. Tom and Laura Weatherton, when shown a photo of it, couldn't be sure. Mark had several belts. It could have been his, or it could have belonged to any hiker, any lost object from decades past. It was a frustratingly ambiguous find. Another day, they found a small cave, its entrance partially hidden by a rock slide that looked relatively recent, perhaps within the last 10 or 20 years. The interior was damp, cold. They searched it thoroughly. Animal bones, some old graffiti, but nothing that screamed Mark Weatherton. It didn't quite match the descriptions from the photos. The wooden planks were missing. The forest felt like a labyrinth, its secrets buried deep. The searchers felt like they were chasing ghosts, guided by the flickering, unreliable light of Mark's last images. The sheer scale of the wilderness was overwhelming. How could they possibly find one small hidden spot after so much time had passed? The psychic toll on the searchers was evident. The hope that had fueled them initially was ground down by the relentless indifference of the woods. Each fruitless day was another layer of discouragement. What if the shelter had collapsed? What if it had been completely reclaimed by nature, leaving no trace? What if it wasn't even in this part of the park? Mark could have wandered for miles, or been taken miles. Corbin began to feel the oppressive weight of the wilderness himself. It was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to human sorrow or human justice. It had swallowed a boy 15 years ago, and it seemed determined to keep whatever secrets it held. He thought of the stick figure drawing, a small prone figure, a larger, standing one. That image haunted him more than any other. It wasn't just about finding a location anymore. It was about understanding what that drawing meant. What horror had Mark tried to convey in that final, desperate message? The search was eventually scaled back, then officially suspended. They had found nothing definitive. No crude shelter, no body. The forest, it seemed, was not yet ready to give up its dead or its secrets. The belt buckle remained an isolated, uncertain clue. The woods remained silent, watchful, holding the truth of Mark Weatherton's fate locked tightly within its ancient heart. The question lingered, heavy and unanswered. What else was out there, hidden from sight, waiting to be found, or perhaps never to be found at all? The investigation, stalled by the fruitless search of the forest, turned increasingly to the silent witnesses, the photographs themselves. Detective Corbin knew that if Alistair Finch wasn't talking, and the woods weren't yielding any new physical evidence, then the answers, or at least stronger clues, had to lie within those 38 grainy images. He brought in outside experts, forensic photographers, criminal profilers, even a specialist in interpreting visual data from survival situations. They gathered in a sterile conference room, the images projected onto a large screen, each one dissected, debated, and re-examined. The forensic photographers focused on the technical aspects. Could the type of digital noise or artifacting in the low-light shots indicate the model of the camera more precisely, perhaps leading to a better understanding of its capabilities and limitations? Could the angle of shadows in the few outdoor shots give a more accurate time of day, a more precise trajectory of Mark's movements before he entered the shelter? They determined the camera was a very early consumer digital model, with a tiny sensor and a fixed focus lens. Its flash was weak, its battery life notoriously short. Mark would have been struggling to capture anything clearly, especially in his presumed state of fear and distress. This only made the images he did capture seem more significant, more desperate. The criminal profilers looked at the sequence, the content. What did it say about Mark's psychological state? The initial selfie showed fear, but also a degree of agency. He was still trying to document, to understand. The later chaotic images, the dark blurs, did they indicate panic? A struggle? Disorientation due to injury or dehydration? Or were they taken under duress? The drawing of the stick figures was a Rorschach test of horror. One profiler suggested it was classic child trauma art, a way of processing an overwhelming, terrifying event. The larger figure was clearly dominant, threatening. It wasn't an animal. The upright posture was distinctly human. He's telling us he was confronted by a person, the profiler stated, her voice grim. And he perceived that person as a threat, someone who had power over him. Another expert, who specialized in survival psychology, pointed to the photos of the confined space. If he found this place himself, she theorized, it was likely a desperate attempt to find shelter from the elements, or from a perceived threat. But the photos don't feel like someone settling in. They feel like someone trapped, someone scared in the shelter, not just of the outside. She pointed to the upward shot of the wooden planks. He's looking for a way out, or he's documenting his confinement. But what if he hadn't found the shelter? What if he'd been taken there? The questions multiplied, each theory branching into more possibilities, more dead ends. Was the drawing made before or after an attack? Was it a depiction of something he saw, or something that happened to him? The ambiguity was a torment. Corbin felt like he was drowning in maybes. The photos were a story, but key pages were missing, torn out, leaving only terrifying fragments. The expert opinions, while insightful, couldn't provide the concrete answers he needed. They could only deepen the sense of tragedy, the chilling possibilities of what Mark had endured. The camera's memory card was re-examined with even more advanced software. Were there any deleted files? Any metadata hidden in the code? Nothing new emerged. The 38 images were all that remained, a finite, closed loop of terror. The trail of digital breadcrumbs ended with that crude, horrifying drawing. After that, silence. The battery likely died. Or the camera was taken. Or Mark was no longer able to use it. The frustration was immense. They had more than they'd had for 15 years, but it still wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to find Mark's body. It wasn't enough to identify his tormentor, if there was one. It was enough to paint a picture of his fear, his isolation, His desperate fight for survival, but not enough to bring justice or even true closure. The experts packed their briefcases, offered their sympathies, and left Corbin with the same haunting images, now imbued with even more layers of dreadful meaning. The case felt like it was sinking under the weight of its own mystery. The photos, once a beacon of potential revelation, now seemed like a cruel taunt, a glimpse into an abyss from which no clear answers would ever emerge. The heavy weight of the unknown settled back over the Weatherton case, heavier than before, because now they knew just enough to imagine the true extent of the horror. They knew Mark hadn't just been lost. He'd been in a dark place, with dark things happening around him, or to him, and the camera had recorded it, a silent, unblinking witness, its story forever incomplete, forever horrifying. The investigators kept returning to the final sequence of images on Mark Weatherton's camera. The last few were the darkest, the most chaotic, almost abstract, in their depiction of fear. If there was a key, a definitive clue, it had to be here, in these last desperate frames. Dave, the crime lab technician, worked tirelessly, coaxing every possible detail from the degraded digital files. He isolated the second-to-last clear image, the one looking up at the underside of rough wooden planks, with light filtering through the gaps. "Look at the wood grain," Dave said, pointing to an enhanced section on his monitor. "And these marks here, they look like tool marks, but crude. An axe, maybe, or a hatchet. Not sawn timber." This suggested a makeshift construction, not part of any official park structure or even a well-built illegal cabin, more like a hunter's blind, but enclosed. Or something more sinister, a hideout, a trap. Then, the very last discernible image before the camera presumably died or was stopped, the drawing scratched into the earth. The small, prone stick figure, the larger, dominant one standing beside it. They had stared at it for hours, days. But now, looking at it again after the analysis of the planks, a new, chilling thought emerged. What if the drawing wasn't just a general depiction of his fear? What if it was specific to his location? What if the ground it was scratched into was the earthen floor of that crude shelter, and the figures depicted something that happened, or was about to happen, inside that shelter? This was where the partial reveal or twist began to solidify, not in identifying a culprit, but in understanding the nature of Mark's final ordeal. He wasn't just lost and scared in the wilderness. He was in a specific, man-made, and terrifying place, and he was not alone there. The team went back to the slightly earlier, very dark photos taken inside the shelter. One, which had initially appeared to be almost entirely black, was subjected to extreme contrast enhancement. Faint shapes began to resolve. In one corner of the frame, almost lost in the digital noise, was something that looked like a pile of rags or old clothes, and next to it, something else. Something that made Detective Corbin's blood run cold. It was a shape that could have been a length of rope or a chain. It was indistinct, blurry, open to interpretation. But in the context of everything else, the confinement, the drawing, the fear in Mark's selfie, it was horrifyingly suggestive. The twist wasn't a sudden unmasking of a villain. It was the dawning, sickening realization that Mark Weatherton had likely been held captive. He hadn't just stumbled into a hole to escape the cold. He'd been imprisoned, however crudely. The photos were not just the record of a lost boy. They were the record of a victim. This new interpretation cast the earlier photos in an even more sinister light. The chaotic blurs, were they escape attempts? The hand reaching out, was it pleading for help from within his prison? The last photo, the drawing, now felt like his final, desperate message, a testament to what he was enduring. He was telling them, "I am here. I am helpless. There is someone else." This realization, while not solving the crime, painted a far more terrible picture of Mark's fate. He hadn't simply succumbed to the elements. He had faced a human monster, the profilers agreed. The evidence, circumstantial as it was within the photos themselves, pointed towards a predatory abduction, likely opportunistic, by someone who knew how to use the remote wilderness to their advantage. Someone who could build or utilize a hidden, crude confinement. Someone who could make a 14-year-old boy vanish, not just from a trail, but from the world. Corbin felt a deep, profound anger, mixed with a terrible sadness for Mark and for his parents. They would have to be told this new interpretation. It would be another blow, another layer of horror, but it was closer to the truth, however ugly. The most chilling photo, in this new light, became that last drawing. It was no longer just a symbol of fear, it was a depiction of his reality. A small, powerless figure, at the mercy of a larger, threatening one. It was a scene of subjugation, of terror. What, Corbin wondered, had made Mark scratch that into the dirt? Was it a final act of defiance? A desperate attempt to leave a clue, any clue, knowing his time was running out? Or was it something he was forced to do? The questions were still there, but the central mystery of what happened to Mark seemed to be resolving into its most dreadful form. He was not just lost, he was taken. He was not just a victim of the uncaring wilderness, he was the victim of a calculating human evil. And the camera, his silent companion, had recorded the ghostly echoes of that evil. The forest still held the secret of who, but the photos now screamed the terrible truth of what, and that truth was a nightmare. The investigation into Mark Weatherton's disappearance, reinvigorated by the discovery of his camera, eventually reached a familiar, frustrating impasse. The photos, while painting a horrifying picture of Mark's probable captivity and terror, did not provide the kind of concrete evidence needed to identify a perpetrator or locate his remains. Alistair Finch, the scoutmaster, remained under a cloud of suspicion, his early negligence and questionable judgment forever tied to the case. But there was nothing in the photos to directly link him to Mark's fate after the boy was left alone. The classic legal system, as Mark's father, Tom, had bitterly called it years ago, required more than unsettling images and strong suspicions. It required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And that proof remained elusive. Detective Corbin had to deliver the news to Tom and Laura Weatherton. He sat with them again in their quiet kitchen, the weight of his words heavy in the air. He explained the new interpretation of the photos, the likelihood that Mark had been held captive, that he hadn't been alone in his final hours. Laura wept, a deep, shuddering grief that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Tom listened, his face carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a cold, impotent fury. So he was taken, Tom said, his voice dangerously low. Someone did this to him. And they're still out there. Corbin could only nod. We believe so, Mr. Weatherton. But the photos don't tell us who. The bittersweet, dark catharsis for the Weathertons was almost unbearable. They now knew their son hadn't just wandered off and succumbed to a lonely, accidental death. He had fought. He had been aware. He had tried to document his ordeal. There was a terrible kind of validation in that. He hadn't been careless. He had been a victim. But it also meant his suffering had been prolonged, his end violent, and at the hands of another. The knowledge was a poisoned cup. It brought a horrifying clarity, but no peace. The case remained open, but active leads dwindled. The photos were analyzed and reanalyzed until there was nothing more to glean. The small, rusted belt buckle found in the woods was tested for DNA, but years of exposure had yielded nothing conclusive. It remained a tantalizing, frustrating maybe. The town of Oakhaven talked. Theories abounded. Was it a local? A transient passing through? Had Finch known more than he let on? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, fueling a quiet, persistent unease. Mark Weatherton's story became a local legend, reborn, now with a darker, more terrifying chapter. The sense of loss for Tom and Laura was profound, a wound that would never heal, only scar over in jagged, painful ways. They had a few more pieces of their son's final story, but the puzzle was still incomplete, its central image, his fate, his killer, shrouded in darkness. The reflection for the community, and for Corbin, was a disturbing one. A child could be taken, could vanish into the wilderness or into the hands of an unseen predator, and the truth could remain hidden for decades, perhaps forever. The photos were a testament to Mark's courage, his desperate attempt to communicate, but also a stark reminder of the limits of justice, the persistence of evil. The mystery of what truly happened in that crude shelter, who that larger stick figure represented, remained unsolved. The forest kept its secrets. The camera, its images now etched into the memory of all who saw them, became a symbol of that enduring mystery, a haunting glimpse into a young boy's final, terrifying journey. Mark's body was never found. No one was ever charged in connection with the new evidence. The case of Mark Weatherton, the boy who vanished in 1998, returned to the cold files, now accompanied by a small memory card filled with ghostly images, a silent, incomplete scream from the past. The disturbing realization was that the story was out there, the truth known to at least one other person, but likely locked away forever. For Mark's parents, there was no closure, only the enduring ache of his absence, now compounded by the terrible images of his fear. The quiet finality was that some doors, once opened, reveal only deeper darkness, and some stories have no end, only a haunting, tragic echo. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.